Great. So thank you again all for being here. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Merav.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, thanks for coming. And let me start a presentation. Oh, before I do that, so, it's a very small group. Let's, we have Carl joining us. We can wait for a second. Carl, would you like to introduce yourself quickly before we get started? Okay, she might not be able to hear. Okay, so let's make it less official than, it's not a webinar. The whole point of this presentation is to learn how to identify ants. There's very little other than that. I'll cover the different species we might see and how to differentiate them. And also a little bit of information about the survey itself and how we do that, even though we'll repeat a little bit of that when we do the actual survey. But the whole point is to learn how to distinguish the different species. And please feel free to, just ask questions. You could type them in, but even better if you just unmute yourself and ask me whatever you'd like. If the background noise is too much, please let me know. I can close the door, but then I'll start sweating. So, yeah. I can't hear you though. It's good? It's good now, but, those kids might get too excited about whatever they're doing there. Yeah, so just let me know, because it could be a lot. Okay, let's see if I can actually show my screen. Yes. So I'm assuming you could see a presentation, which is, yeah, good, thank you. So again, feel free to stop me at any point and ask questions. But other than that, let's start. So usually this is how we do the training. We have a half-a-day training where we do the presentation. We have this table with all sorts of ants that Matthew mostly collects the day before. Most of them make it, and then we can look at them in petri dishes, and we have a presentation and we go for a walk. But this year we decided to split it a little bit, so we'll do the presentation portion today, and then we'll have 1 or 2 walks later on before the actual survey. And we do it because it's fun. So I didn't introduce myself. I've started doing this in 2010, I think. So it's about 12 years. And this is the 30th year of the survey, which means that this year we'll make new t-shirts. We made t-shirts 10 years ago, and this is our chance. So the survey started in 1993, trying to document the invasion of Argentine ant, which is our most common invasive species into Jasper Ridge. We have about 30 native species and 2 non-native species that we monitor. This is the other non-native species. It's called Cardiocondyla mauritanica, sometimes called twig ant, but there's a different twig ant. And all these dots are where we survey ants. The red ones are where we found this species. So it's not very common, but we still would like to monitor them and learn more about their distribution in Jasper Ridge, because it's not completely understood what's going on there. It's just very, very spotty. But they're also not as highly invasive as the Argentine ant is. So these are some of the native species that we see. And I think one of the great things about doing this training and participating in the ant survey is that you're not just learning about the ants of Jasper Ridge. These are ants that you'll see in many different places in the Bay Area, and also in other places, because some of these genera, like the genus Camponotus, you'd see it even if you go to Australia. Same with Chromatogaster. So you could learn some of these features, and then you'll recognize them even in other places. Because it's more about like what to look at and like what are the important characteristics and how do we differentiate ants in general. So these are some of the native species, where our most common species called the winter ant or the small honeypot ant, and Prenolepis. And we have a short list of invasive species in the Bay Area, mostly these 4 species, but sometimes you encounter others, with these 2 as the most common non-native species. the two that we have in Jasper Ridge. The other two are more in urban places than in nature preserves or open spaces. Okay, so the survey started in 1993 by a student from the Gordon Lab at Stanford, and again trying to document the invasion of the Argentine ant into Jasper Ridge, and it's done every May and September or something similar. We survey about 250 points in Jasper Ridge, and these points are 100 meters apart. We survey a 20-meter radius around each point. So yeah, and we spend 5 person minutes. So we use just one method to survey ants. If you did any kind of other insect surveys, then there are different methods. This has been proven to be the best method actually to find as many ant species as possible. It's called visual search, and it basically means that we spend these 5 minutes searching for ants in different ways that I will mention, and will also demonstrate that during our training walk. This could be one person looking for 5 minutes, or 2 people looking for 2.5 minutes. But it's really important for us to use the exact same protocol, because we want to be able to compare the results of this upcoming survey with everything we had so far in previous years, which is pretty amazing. So as Matthew mentioned, this used to be done by one graduate student that would survey the entire preserve for a whole month with a docent like Matthew, and then analyze the results, publish the data. But about 13 years ago, it became community science project, and we have a wonderful pool of volunteers. And we go out in small teams of 2 or 3 people and survey a few of the points at a time. So each group will get about 12 different points, and we'll navigate from one to the next and do the survey. Okay, so here I have a few of our old slides, but I also want to show something else. So in here you could see some of previous data. So this is just where Argentine ant is present in one random time point, fall 2015. Okay, so you can see that I found mostly on this edge of the preserve, and then a little bit on in this area. In 1993, when they started the survey, they thought they'll document how the Argentine ant would take over the entire preserve, but they actually never made it to the middle, which is probably just too dry for them. They need to maintain some distance, minimum distance from human disturbance, which is basically buildings and irrigation. So they cannot reach this area, which is really interesting. It's another one of these things, but I want to show you this one, which shows you all the surveys together until 2015. So you can see that many of these points never had Argentine ants in them, which I think is pretty interesting. And also really important, because if you get, so you will get, your 12 different points to survey. If you find Argentine ants in the middle of the preserve, it's really important to collect them, because sometimes, you might mistake Argentine ant with something else, especially if it's one of your first surveys. And we want to make sure that if we document Argentine ants here, they really were in that point, because sometimes you might not be sure, and then we go back to the same spot, look for the ants, but we might not find them, and it's difficult to know what to do with that data. One last figure. This is a really cool map that shows you the ant diversity in each of these points. So each color represents a different ant species. Red is Argentine ant, blue is winter ant, okay? And then the other ones represent different species like carpenter ants and harvester ants and different things. And you could see that where we have Argentine ants, we usually have either only Argentine ants and nothing else, or Argentine ants and the winter ants that can somewhat tolerate them, which is subject for a different lecture, but it's a really interesting study. In any case, you could see that they displace most of the species, and they have pretty significant impact on the native ants that live in the preserve. And you can see that where there are no Argentine ants, there's pretty high ant diversity. You can also see that in a few places, you might find Argentine ants in addition to some of these native species, which is also interesting. At this point, I'd like to show you this website. Can you see this? Okay. So, thank you. So this map was created using our data by, sorry, I forgot his name. Matthew, if you could jump in. Okay. Anyway, it was created using our data, and it's pretty cool. So you could see, for example, all the spring surveys on this map. So Argentine ant only is the red X, and then orange is Argentine ants and other native species, and then green is just native species. Okay, so let's kind of look at it quickly. This is Jasper Ridge. If you haven't been here before, if you've only been here briefly, this is the reservoir, and the fill station is here. This is Sand Hill Road. Okay, so basically you will drive here, park here, and then go to one of these places, or actually park from the other side and walk into the preserve. But anyway, let's quickly just look at the how this changed through time. So you could see that the edge still has lots of Argentine ants throughout the years, but we did notice that it changes from time to time depending on drought years, on very wet years. In wet years, the Argentine ants can penetrate deeper into the preserve. In dry years, they retract. And it would be very interesting to see what we'll find this year. And we're always 2007, where you could see that, you know, it's kind of difficult to look at the differences, but if we focus on this area, you can see that in some of the surveys, we only find native species in this area that used to be Argentine ants only, which I think is really interesting. So let's just go through all of them. So you see there's more native species, less Argentine ants in some of the surveys. It's not always the same. And we also need to keep in mind that it's much easier to find Argentine ants than native species, because usually when we have Argentine ants, so look how many places lost their Argentine ants. Usually when they're, and these were very dry years, when you have Argentine ants, it's really easy to find them because they're very abundant. Okay, so any questions, any comments, anything? So, no?
I will just chime in that if you haven't been to Jasper Ridge before, the ant survey provides a really unique opportunity to see the preserve and also get off trail. Typically, when people visit, they are on dose and lead tours, and you have to stick to the trails. But the ant survey actually requires us to get off in the beaten track and really explore the preserve. So,
and the spring survey is amazing because there's so many flowers out there now. It's amazing. I should have changed the presentation just to photos of Jasper Ridge from the past few weeks, and I think you'd come running because it's amazing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the survey, and then we'll talk about the ants. So again, it's 5 person minutes, and we will emphasize that before we do the actual survey again, because it will be in a few weeks, just to remind everyone. So either 5 minutes per one person or 2 minutes per 2 people, 2.5 minutes, sorry. We survey about 250 points, and it's radius about 20 meters around each point. And they used to be marked with stakes, but we lost most of them throughout the years. So we use a tablet to both help us navigate and also to document our findings. And we will show you how to use those when we do the next training. Okay, and we record all the ants that we can, usually to the genus level. So the way it works is you navigate to your first site, and then you place a little temperature and humidity sensor, which is basically a little flag that you need to place in the shade, and remember to pick up on your way out. Otherwise, you can enjoy doubling your steps. We spent a few minutes, not more than like 5 minutes, kind of looking around, adjusting to that area and thinking where would be the best place to find ants. And we will show you how to do that, because it's not random. They have their preferred places. There are places where they nest, places where they forage, places that, plants they prefer, things that they might prefer. So it's really important to keep that in mind, because you only have 5 minutes and it's very short. When you're ready, you begin the survey, record all the ants you find within the time limit, and then everything else you found before or after goes into comments. Okay. You will get an aspirator, which I don't have near me. What I did prepare is a giant orange ant, very useful, but not the aspirator. So the aspirator is like a little sucking machine that you will use to collect ants into a little vial. And if you find something you're not sure about, or if you find that Argentine ant in the middle of the preserve where it's not really supposed to be, collect that. So you suck it into the vial, and then you add a little piece of paper with the number of that point, okay? And I would also suggest at this point to guess what it is, because you would most likely be correct. So you could say Formica, ? And then write it down in your, maybe, but you should, and I'll explain why. Because, so write it down in your paper, so you'll get a real piece of paper to write down your findings, and also the tablet, okay, where you enter the data. And in both, you should write down Formica ? Because even if you're incorrect, you're most likely in the next spot. So all your routes, all your points are usually in the same habitat. So you're somewhat likely to find the same ant on your next point, or the third one. And then you could say, oh yeah, I don't know what it is, but it's the same as the other one. So instead of saying unknown 1, 2, 3, you could say Formica ? Or Camponotus ? And then afterwards, you take all these ants with you back to the lab, and we'll try and identify them, and then we can correct everything and go back and say, yeah, the Formica was actually Camponotus or whatever, and correct that. So yeah, so you could either use unknown 1, 2, 3, or you could guess a name, and use that again. Okay, and then you survey all your points, collect your temperature and humidity sensor, and go back to the lab to identify everything you weren't sure about. And, some of these tiny ants, it's just easier to ID with a microscope. But if you feel comfortable, that's awesome. Like, if you know what you're identifying, that's great. But if you're not sure about it, it's always good to collect it and make sure you're right. Okay, so how do we find ants? We look on the ground. We look for nests, even though most of the nests in our area don't look like much. So most of them are just a tiny hole in the ground. They don't even make mounds. Sometimes after the rain, they look a bit more impressive, but in general, they're not that easy to find. We look for ants on tree trunks, and they have favorite plants. Oaks are a huge one. So they love coast live oaks, and they would sometimes use other oaks as well, but coast live oaks are the best. Coyote brush, another favorite. You are allowed to look under rocks and logs and things, but keep in mind, Jasper Ridge is a pretty pristine area, and we try to keep it that way. So if you look under rocks and logs, do it gently, and only if you think you could put it back the way it was. You might find a whole nest under that, and that would be terrific, or a few ants, but be respectful. In the springtime, we have the advantage of looking for ants on different things that we don't see in the fall. Flowering plants, especially ones with nectaries. So some plants like vetch have extra floral nectaries that are highly attractive to ants. Coyote brush. Some of the annuals like Italian thistle is really attractive to aphids. So ants love aphids. Anything that has aphids might attract ants. So if you know how to find aphids, that's great. Otherwise, you could look at some of the weeds, some of the green stuff you see in the spring might have aphids, and that could attract ants. It's just like placing bait. And if you look at, a random spot in Jasper Ridge, where would you look for ants? So there are different like microhabitats here, right? You have the trail, which is a really easy place to look for movement. So sometimes you'll see ants crossing the trail. And when we do an ant survey, it's not just about identifying the ant from a photo. You look a lot at the behavior of the ants and the habitat or microhabitat where you find it. So for example, here you might see ants running around the trail, and the way they move, how many you see, if they're walking on a trail, if there's just one of them or a few of them. That's really important in order to identify them. So if I was in a place like that, I would look on the trail, and then I would look at some of these plants. So there is coast live oak, probably this thing, maybe this one, maybe that one. I would spend some time looking at that, which means kind of staring at the leaves, staring at the trunk to see if there's movement or trails going up and down the oak. I would look at the different plants here and see if there's coyote brush, or if there are little annual plants that might have aphids on them. I would look in the leaf litter. So some of these ants would be foraging or nesting in the leaf litter, and I wouldn't touch it. I would just look at it, because some of these ants, once you start touching things, they would hide. So it's better to look and then try and see what you find. If you need to, you could try and aspirate them, but they might escape, and then it's very difficult to find them again, especially in the leaf litter. But also on plants. So some of the ants would drop down if you disturb them. So it's always better to try and figure out what they are without touching them and without getting too close. Again, looking at the tree trunk, you might see trails of ants going up and down the trees. Galls. So if you know what galls are, these are structures induced by insects on plants. Some of them, they could look like different things, and they're mostly on oaks, but also on other plants. Some of them secrete honeydew. So honeydew is like sugar water that plants secrete, and those are very attractive to ants, which is also the reason why they're attractive to aphids, because the aphids secrete honeydew as well. So if you know how to find these galls, that would be a really good place to look for ants. On leather oak, on blue oak, valley oak as well. Yeah, more ants. Okay, so again, aphids. Aphids are really important. And what else? Nests. So nests don't look like much, but this is carpenter ant, Camponotus ant nest. Okay, so the nest really doesn't look like much, 2 holes in the ground, but you can see that they clear the nest area, okay, and the trail area. This is the trail. They're probably kind of pissed living right next to a harvester ant nest that makes a lot of mess, because they collect seeds and all the leftover, seed chaff. They take that out, and that might create a little mound for a while, but the wind would blow it away. So I'm not sure they make good neighbors, but whatever. Anyway, this is the harvester ant nest. In the harvester ant nest, by the way, you might find, like in the nest opening, you might find some other things, like dead insects that they ate and dead ants, which we are interested in. And you can document that, because dead ants decay very quickly. Like they would dry out and break within a few days. So if you see dead ants, you can document them as present. But you need to make sure that the nest that you see is actually active, because some of these ants, especially the harvester ants, they tend to move somewhat often. They'll leave their nest and make a new one. So you have to make sure the nest is actually occupied. And one way to do it is to disturb them and, make them pissed, because some of these ants they might not be active if it's too hot, or they're nocturnal, so they won't be out, but they might still be in there. You could use your aspirator to blow some CO2 directly into the nest entrance. Or you could take a little twig if you watched, National Geographic, like chimpanzees do that very well. You could do the same thing. Take a little twig and stick it into the nest entrance, and the ants might come out or, bite a twig. But you need to make sure that the ants are still there. And you can find really interesting ants dead around that nest entrance of the harvester ants. But this is the carpenter ant nest. Okay, any questions, comments, things? Ants? No. Okay. So what would you need? You need an aspirator. We would supply that. If you have one, please bring it with you. And the one we give you, please keep it for future surveys. Bring water, sun hat, long sleeve clothes. Expect ticks. If you like ticks, this is your place. We have plenty. We have ticks for everyone. So you can wear a Tyvek suit if it's not crazy hot. That would keep ticks away. You could shower in Jasper Ridge. It's pretty good. You could just change your clothes when you're done. If there's something that we have more than ticks, it's poison oak. Poison oak is everywhere. If you're sensitive to poison oak, I mean, everybody's sensitive. If you're very sensitive, let us know, and we could try and team you in the only one route that, doesn't have poison oak. But I mean, you don't need to worry about it too much. Just change your clothes when you're done. And what else? We will give you handlines, some ant guides, not the GPS. We'll give you the tablet that you need, and temperature and humidity sensor. Please bring your phone so you can reach you. And this is poison oak. We will show that at the training if you're not sure how to identify it. It's all over the place. So I suggest just bring, change of clothes and change after the survey. Will be good for the ticks as well. There are all sorts of resources, and you could look for different papers by the Gordon Lab and different things. And yeah, last message here. If you don't know what it is, collect it. Okay, let's move to the ants. So now I'd like to go over the different ants we might see in Jasper Ridge, depending on where you go. Because if you go to the perimeter, remember, you'll mostly see Argentine ants, sometimes winter ants, sometimes other things. It's really important because we want to know what's out there. It's slightly less exciting, but it's nice because it's easier. It's easier to find Argentine ants. Anyway, these are some of the ants that we see in Jasper Ridge. And okay, is it an ant? You'd be surprised that even ant researchers sometimes find it difficult to know if something is an ant. So ants in general, they are insects. They are related to bees and wasps. So they have 3 body parts: their head, thorax, and abdomen or gaster, because this entire thing is actually the abdomen. So depending on the group of ants, and I should say, if this is the first time you hear anything about ant anatomy, then you can ignore most of this. If you've already done some surveys and you're ready to learn more, then you could tune in for this information. I find it useful, but it's like, it could be overwhelming. If this is the first time, you might think, okay, this is too much. But the more you do it, you kind of notice all these little differences. Okay, if you're new to the whole thing, your take-home message should be, look at the antenna. Okay, they have this elbow in the antenna, which would differentiate them from wasps and other insects, and that's a really useful thing. Okay, if you're ready for a little bit more, then we look at this area, okay, between the abdomen and the thorax, and that would tell us which subfamily they belong to. All the ants belong to one family, and there are different subfamilies. And the best way to tell them apart is looking at this area, okay? Sometimes the ants might have some spines here. We look at the length of the antenna and the legs compared to their body. We look at the size of the eye and the position of the eye. We look at the color. We look at the fact, is it shiny or not shiny? Okay. So there are different things that you could look at when you try to identify an ant. Okay. So again, about the petiole, that little segment between the abdomen and the thorax, in one group, there are two of them. In one major group, let's say, there are two of them, petiole and postpetiole, and those are visible, okay? And with your hand lens, you could, I'll show you how, you could hold an ant with 2 fingers, and then you could magnify it, and you could see those little nodes, okay? And you could say, oh, that belongs to that subfamily. Formicine ants, and this is a very large group, okay? The mimicine ants that have the 2 nodes here, that would be the harvester ant, it would be a phenogaster, fire ants, if you find one, which we don't have, all sorts of species, okay? Temnothorax, Caudicondalia, the little invasive one, okay? And then this group is the formicine ants. So they don't have a stinger. They have 1 segment here. And if they need to defend themselves, they will bite you and spray formic acid on that. And they smell like formic acid. When you aspirate them, you can often smell that. That's the carpenter ant, formica, field ant, and some of these larger ants that we have. This group actually has a stinger. They have a sting at the end of their abdomen, and none of the ants in this area actually stings. But in general, like if you had a fire ant, that would go into this category, okay? And then this group is another large subfamily, which includes the Argentine ant and also the banana cream pie ant, if you haven't heard of those before. One thing we use for our trainings is smell, which is more difficult online, but you know, we'll do that on the survey. So smelling ants could be very useful because they have all these chemical compounds that they use for communication, and you could gently convince them to secrete some of those pheromones, and then you could tell, oh, it's banana cream pie ant. Okay, so for this group, you actually don't see the node, but it's there. So it has a little segment there, but it's hidden. Okay, any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were saying they have an elbow, but the one in the middle, it looks like the elbow.
Yeah, but it's basically because it's doing this. But you could see that the first segment is very, very long. And then this section, you know, is like now straight, but it could probably do
They can
that.
bend
Yeah.
right there.
And the difference is that if you look at some of the wasps that really look like ants, usually the entire antenna would look like this, okay? Many, many tiny segments. So yeah, great question. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
I have a
So
question.
yeah.
In bees, the elbow in the antenna is called the pedicel.
Mm-hmm.
Is it similar in ants?
Probably, but it's been a while since I did.
Because they don't point that out in the
Yeah.
that little picture there.
Yeah, I can check later. Remind me if we have time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
because it's been a while since I did ant taxonomy. Luckily, it's not fun. Well, it's somewhat fun. Anyway, let's start with the formicine ants. Okay, so again, no sting. They have 1 little segment here. Okay, that is pretty visible, and they can spray formic acid, which you could sometimes smell, especially if you aspirate them. Okay, the first species is the winter ant, or the small honey ant, Phenolopis imparis, which I think is really interesting. It's widespread across the continent. It's called the winter ant because it estivates in summer. They sleep in summer and you can't actually see them. They're not active. They store food in their bellies. So this is a photo of a nest under a log or a rock. And you can see that they have specialized workers that store food in their bellies, just like the honeypot ants, but much smaller. They nest in the ground, but they forage on the ground and also on vegetation. So they're very common on the trees and on different vegetation. It's a very common ant. You might find many of them in the area. The shape, so to identify them, you could see that they're black, they're very dark, very shiny, okay? They have pretty long legs and antenna, mostly all same color, kind of pointy head and pointy abdomen like other formicine ants. And what else? They have tiny eyes. Okay, so any questions?
Is that a different species that
Yes.
that little one?
Yeah, that's the bonus ant. Okay, this is the
Bonus ant.
methorax. Yeah, which was sneaking in with the big girls. So these are actually not big ants. They're small to medium-sized ants. Okay. And our next species is carpenter ant, which is actually not one species, but in Jasper Ridge we have 4 or 5 different carpenter ant species. This is Camponotus. Okay, that's the genus. And we have different species. We don't expect you to identify them to species level because it's too complicated. We do it in the lab. So there's no need for that. We just say that we saw carpenter ants. The largest ants we have in Jasper Ridge, but not all species. There's some species that are much smaller. They are nocturnal mostly. So if you go on a night hike, you might see them. You might still see them during the day, just not in very large numbers, and there won't be much activity. You probably won't see them on a very hot day like today in the middle of the day, but they'll be active early in the morning, late in the afternoon, and at night. They really love honeydew, so you might see them on trees, you might see them on different vegetation where there's aphids around. Depending on the species, some of them nest in the ground, like the nest I showed you before, how they clear their area around the nest, but some nest in dead trees. They're not as bad as termites though, because they don't feed on the trees, they just use them for nests. And in this area, I don't think any of them is, significant pests. And they're different species, so, you can find them in different states. The best way to identify this genus is to hold them with your 2 fingers and then look at the shape of the thorax. So if you see this arch shape, okay, one hump or an arch, then this is a carpenter ant. And again, if you'll go to Australia and catch a little carpenter ant, which I wouldn't catch anything in Australia because everything could kill you, right? But if you did end up catching an ant, it should have the same arch here. And these are, in general, large ants with large eyes, pretty long antennas and legs. Yeah. And then our next genus is Formica, or field ant. And here again, there are a few different species that we find in Jasper Ridge. This is one, probably Formica mochi. It's not that easy to tell them to species. We call everything that looks like this Formica mochi, and it's probably correct most of the time. Their behavior is very useful for their identification. So they ran very fast, and their movement is kind of like a spider. They don't really walk in a straight line, but like you see them often crossing the trail, and they don't just walk in straight line, and they don't make a trail. So these ants don't make any trail. They just wander around, and you would see 1 or 2 or 3. If you see more than that, you're probably very close to the nest. If you see much more than that, you're probably standing on the nest, and I advise you to run because they can sting, but they will definitely bite. And it's not that bad, but it's also not very pleasant. And they do stink. So if you put them in a vial, you will smell that, the formic acid. They're very active even when it's hot. So in the middle of the day, most ants would be gone. These ladies would still be out there on coyote brush and different plants and still foraging. They love the oaks, so you would see them going up and down on the oak trunk. If you get too close, they see you. They have these large eyes, and they might drop down to the ground. You might see them also on the leaf litter. And again, if you try to catch them, they might just disappear in the leaf litter and you'll never see them again. The best way to identify them is to look at the large eye and the length of the legs and antenna. They're pretty long compared to their body. You could also see this little segment here, okay, the petiole. And let's talk about this part. So this is the thorax again, But in this case, it has 2 humps, okay? And again, if you hold it with your 2 fingers, you could see that from a side view. Because some of the Formica species, they might look like a carpenter ant. Both of these genera are pretty large, somewhat similar in the way they run and the way they look. So this is useful if you're not sure what they are. And because they don't all look the same. So this is the Formica mochi. And so this one is called Formica subpolita. So this is another Formica. To me, it kind of looked like carpenter ant, especially depending on the colors, but because it's very shiny. Okay, the carpenter ants are pretty shiny. You can see the Formica mochi is not shiny at all, which means that it has something on the cuticle that makes it less shiny than this ant, for example. But still, if you look at it, if you hold this one and look at it from side view, you'll still see these 2 humps. Okay, and still has this large eye, long legs, and antenna. These are not very common, but in some places you see lots of them, like specific trails where they nest in the middle of the trail. You might see lots of these ants around. Okay, so it's important to get yourself familiar with them. And again, comparing Formica field ant with a carpenter ant, the side view is very useful. Okay, any questions? If you feel like, okay, I want to find some ants, since we're not going on a walk today, you could put some bait out. And, you know, if you have cookies, oil, tuna fish, sugar water, honey, anything like that, you can put that on a little piece of paper outside your home and go back and look at the ants that will come and visit that later today or tomorrow or whenever, and you might find some of these ants. Okay, so our next group, this was the Formitine ants. Now it's the Dolichoderina ants subfamily, and in this case, they still have 1 segment here, but it's kind of small and often hidden. Okay, so you don't always see it. Usually they don't sting. They do have chemical defense, so some of them are pretty smelly, but in a good way, at least for an ant. They smell kind of sweet. So if you gently squeeze them, you don't need to kill them. They will secrete these pheromones, and that could be very helpful when you want to identify them. Okay, so the first species I'd like to mention is the Argentine ant, which has arrived here around 1907, probably with soil on ships. And its native habitat is in Argentina, and it's invasive in many places around the world. I wonder if I need to update that, if there are new countries that it arrived to. It's highly invasive. It's an agricultural pest. It spreads into nature preserve, into lots of places, and cause a lot of damage. Here you find it often in urban settings. You might have these ants in your kitchen, and also in semi-natural habitat. So a natural habitat that is close to a disturbance like a home or irrigation. They move very, very fast, and usually they forage in big groups. So you might see many of them, especially on the oaks. You could see hundreds, if not thousands of ants going up a coastline of oak in the summer. But you might also see just one, which could be slightly confusing, because sometimes, you know, they're kind of wandering around and you might see them. They nest in the ground, and they forage both on the ground and also on vegetation. So again, the oaks, coyote brush, many different plants. They love aphids, so anything that has aphids might be useful. The size is pretty small. They're not the smallest ones, but they're pretty small. They're dark brown. Okay, so they look pretty dark, but not completely black. They're not as shiny as the winter ant that we started with. I'll show you some of these species together in a few slides from now, so that might be helpful. And again, if this seems overwhelming, if you already forgot everything you saw, you'll have all sorts of things that you could use for the survey, and we will team you with someone who knows their ants better, so they can help you learn. Well, not you, Kim, but everyone else. So that would be helpful when you try to learn your ants. Okay, and we'll give you all sorts of guides and different things. And remember that you can always collect the ants when you're not sure about what they were. And we will do our walks, and it will be easier next time you do it. So really don't think that there's no way you can do it, because we all had to learn it at some point. Okay, our next species is the velvety tree ant, which is a really cute ant, kind of fuzzy and fluffy. So it's not shiny, it's covered with little hairs, and you can see the colors. It's gray, orangish, brown, and then gray again with lots of hairs. In this one, I feel like it has much shorter legs and antenna, okay? Especially when you look here. Their eye is not very big, and you could see that it's difficult to notice the petiole, that little node here, okay? Because it's kind of clumped together with the rest of the abdomen. What else? These ants nest in trees, okay? Their workers are called polymorphic workers because they could come in a whole range of sizes. So in the same nest, you might see a tiny worker, a larger worker, something in between, like a whole range of sizes. They will all look the same. So they're all similar in their appearance, but just the size is a whole range. Because most of the other ants I mentioned so far, they actually have just in one nest, most of the ants would look similar in size. It's not always correct, but in general. And carpenter ants actually are an exception because they usually have majors and minors. So the carpenter ants, the Camponotus, the large ant we have, could have much larger ants in the same nest with like a very big head. And those can actually bite you because they have very big mandibles. So they can penetrate your skin. And they will try. Okay, so back to the velvety tree ant. So they nest inside the trees, often in like these old oaks that have some cavities in them. They could have thousands of ants in there. If they don't have enough space, they will actually nest in a few closed trees. And the workers would travel from one tree to the next. In my front yard, I'm very lucky to have a velvety tree ant nest in a few of the trees. So it started on one tree and now it's connected to a few different trees, and you can see them all over the sidewalk, and I check on them from time to time. They look great. The best way to identify these ants is to smell them, because they smell amazing for an ant. So they smell kind of sweet, and it's pretty cool. It's a cool trick to show your friends that you can smell ants. You know, it's awesome. You can taste them. Some of us do that. Not me personally, but someone else on this talk does that. There is another species of velvety tree ant in California, but not in this area. And if you go to Henry Cove, for example, you might see that. It's pretty cool. It looks very similar. It's just completely dark, the color. And it's really nice. Okay. At first, I thought these two species, the velvety tree ant and the field ant, look similar. So this is how I was able to separate these two. I was looking at, because the colors are somewhat similar. You know, the one on the right is a dead ant, so, you know, it's kind of faded a little bit. But the color pattern is somewhat similar. But you could look at the thorax. Okay, so this one will have the two humps. This one doesn't really. Formica has much larger eyes and a longer antenna and leg compared to the body and compared to this species. Okay. Also, if you see tons of them on a tree, that's probably the velvety tree ant, and they smell nice, unlike Formica or field ant that doesn't smell nice. I'm not sure I ever met someone who thought they smell nice. Okay, our next species is the odorous house ant, Tapinoma sessile. So this species, again, is found all over the continent. It's a pretty cool ant. They're really small. They're even slightly smaller than Argentine ant. Okay, so it's a pretty small ant. It's very dark. It's either black or almost black. We find it here both in urban ecosystems, so you might have these ants in your kitchen, but we also find them in open spaces. It's a native species here, so and it's pretty common. They're not always easy to find, but they are pretty common. They can have more than one queen if they are in urban habitats, and they could move the nest frequently. But the important thing is that they would make trails, but not always, just like the Argentine ants that I mentioned, that sometimes you'd see them in a large trail, but sometimes you'll just see one or two. And in this case, you can again smell them. So this ant is also called the banana cream pie ant. I don't know if you've smelled the banana cream pie. I'm not sure what it smells like, but this ant smells kind of sweet. And you could squeeze it a little bit and check. So they're pretty cool. They're less common than Argentine ants and winter ants, but we see them pretty often. What else? So when I try to identify them, I look at their shape. They kind of look like a squeezed Argentine ant to me. The Argentine ant is more elongated. I'll show you them together in a few slides. But this one is kind of squeezed together. You can't see the petiole most of the time, the little node, because it's kind of squished in. And what else? So this is our next subfamily, the myrmidine ants, which is another very large group of ants. This one includes the fire ants that we don't have, but many species that we do have in the preserve. They have two segments here, okay? Some of them have sting, and which does contain, so some ants will bite, but if it's really painful and you get allergic reaction, that's a sting, just like bees and wasps. Some ants can sting, not in this area really. Yeah, they also have chemical defense. So our first species and the largest one is the harvester ant, Vermicer antrae, that is pretty common in the area. And is really important. It's the most important granivore species in serpentine grasslands. So it's really important for seed dispersal in the serpentine grassland. It's also very sensitive to Argentine ant invasion, and we actually see them fighting in Jasper Ridge in some places. Once you learn how to identify their nests, you'll see that they're pretty common. When you go hiking in the grassland, you are pretty likely to see their nest in different places. In the grassland itself, it's very difficult to notice them because they're grasses, but on the trail, on the edge of the trail, you'll often see the big trails, big nests with all the seed shafts and stuff. Okay, they're usually active early in the morning and late at night, even really late at night and during the night. They don't like it when it gets too hot or dry, and they'll go back to the nest. About the behavior. So in the serpentine grassland in Jasper Ridge, for example, you might see their nest by the trail or in the middle of the grassland, and you'll see the trails. So you could see many ants carrying seeds into the nest or going out to collect those seeds. If you're in the beginning of your survey, later on they'll probably all be back in the nest. They're pretty large, dark black, but not that shiny because they have many hairs. They have these really cool spines at the end of the thorax, okay, this segment. And you could see that with a magnifying lens. And what else? Yeah, pretty cool ants. The next one is a Phaenogaster, which is somewhat similar to the harvester ant. It's not as big, it's smaller. But I feel like all these ants in this group of ants, and the myrmidine ants, they're kind of round or boxy head. Their head is either round or squarish, but it's not that elongated as the formicine ant, like the carpenter ant and field ant. And the abdomen as well, okay, this part. It's kind of round, and in this one, it's also shiny. And you could easily see these two nodes here. This is a not so common ant in Jasper Ridge. We sometimes see them in Palo Alto, for example. In Jasper Ridge, they're pretty hard to find. And if you find them and you're not sure about them, just collect them. They feed on some seeds, but not as many as harvester ants. So if you see the nest, it shouldn't have, you know, that nice mound with all the seeds, but it might have more dead insects, which the harvester ants is as well. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so the next species is Chromatogaster, or the acrobat ant, and which is a weird common name that they got because sometimes they might move their abdomen in weird ways or something, whatever. The best way to identify them, and we probably have just one species in Jasper Ridge, they're very dark, shiny. They are pretty small, but not that tiny. They're larger than Argentine ants and maybe slightly larger or the same size as winter ants. So if you look at them from above, their abdomen looks like a heart, okay, with this very pointy abdomen. And they have this boxy square head. If you look at them from the side, you might be able to see these spines, okay? And you could also notice that these nodes, the petiole and postpetiole, they connect to the abdomen pretty high up, okay? So from a side view, they look slightly flat with like a pretty high spot where it connects. The legs and antennas are not very long. They don't walk too fast usually. They could be on a trail or could be alone. They nest in the ground, and we often see them foraging. Usually we'll see them foraging on vegetation, so on the oaks, on different plants. They also like honey. Okay, so I want to show you this slide because I think it's useful to see these 4 different species together. These are 4 dark brown to black little ants. And it's most important for us that you'll be able to identify the Argentine ant, but we also want you to be able to feel comfortable with the other species. So again, the Argentine ant is dark brown and kind of elongated. The large one, by the way, is the queen. Okay, so we probably won't see that one, but you'll definitely see the workers depending on the habitat. So it's kind of elongated, slender ant with short legs and antenna. You can compare that with the other house ant, okay? That is more like a squished in, like a more stubby version of the Argentine ant, okay? Again, the other house ant is smelly, so you need to squeeze it though to smell it. The winter ant is darker, it's black and very shiny. And if you look at that from a side view, you will notice a teardrop shape. I don't have it here on the presentation, but imagine that you're looking at that from the side. You can see that their abdomen is inflated like that, okay? And if you compare it to this species, or even this species, it's very different. And that's the best way to identify them, okay? They have this really large abdomen. Even the regular workers, they don't store any honey in there, okay? And you can see that their antenna and legs are slightly lighter in color compared to the rest of their body. And they have a more like pointy head compared with this acrobat ant, for example. And the acrobat ant is the only one here with spines. Any questions about this or comments or something that you found useful when you tried to identify them to species? If you tried.
I think just I imagine some people might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now, but definitely when you get out in the field and do the ant walks and see them in person, the differences will really jump out to you. So don't be discouraged just that right now it might feel like a little bit of a wash.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there are many species, we want you to learn them, but you could take your time, you could start with a survey in an area that has just Argentine ants and maybe winter ants. And then, it's so much easier. Or just walk with someone experienced, and then you could learn how to spot the ants, and the other person can teach you how to identify them. And you'll see that it's really not that difficult.
One thing that helps me is just my own yard. I have lots of Argentine ants and winter ants as well. So I get to know those really well just by checking out my yard.
Yeah, and you might have quite a few ants in your yard, especially if you don't have Argentine ants. But even if you do, you might have some other species as well. So that's a really good exercise to just either look around or put baits. And I think on my website there's something about like how to set the baits, which is very easy. Like take a piece of paper and, place some food on it and check it out after 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and you'll see some ants. Okay, our next species is this really cute big-headed ant, which sounds big, but it's a tiny, 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 tiny ant that hopefully you can see on the training walk. They're really awesome, shiny, tiny, reddish ants. And they're called big-headed ant because they have two different forms of workers, the regular ones like this, and these ones that have a huge head. And their body is also a little bit bigger, but their head is just huge. They specialize on seeds, so they eat small seeds, but also dead insects. The nest is tiny. They don't have that many workers usually. They could be a little bit active during the day and maybe more active at night. We see their nests in the middle of the trail in some places, and mostly because it's just impossible to find them in other places because they're so tiny. They mostly forage on the ground and collect all sorts of things, including dead insects, but also galls. So we found different galls in their nest entrance, which is pretty cool. So yeah, really cool ants, very tiny. Hopefully we could see those. The next tiny ant is sometimes confused with the previous one. This is Solenopsis. It's called a leaf ant. It's related to the red imported fire ant in southern US. This one doesn't sting. It's really tiny. It's only 2 millimeters long. And you can see it has tiny, tiny eyes. So these ants nest in the ground, but they also forage underground because they specialize on other ants. So they like to eat other ants. And usually we don't see them because they don't spend too much time above ground. But sometimes they do. Sometimes they'll go out and you could find them a little bit active. And the best way to identify them is the unique shape of their antenna and the tiny, tiny, tiny eyes. And they are carnivores. So again, if we look at the big-headed ant, you could see the larger eyes and different shape of antenna. But if you find something like that and you're not sure about them, just collect them. Okay, so pretty cool ants. You might have these at home as well, by the way. Some people, for example, would have them at home. Okay, our next ant is Temnothorax, which I think is a really cool genus. It's called the acorn ant because they're pretty small, and sometimes a whole nest could live and survive in an acorn or a little fruit or seed on the ground. They move very slowly, and usually when you find them, you just find one, and you find them kind of sitting there, not moving, often on the vegetation. So some of them are arboreal, they nest on trees. Some of them nest in the ground. The one I find the most is black and kind of short, and is just, standing there either on the oaks or sometimes on ferns or other lower vegetation. And it's really good to train your eyes to find these ants because they're pretty common in some of our habitats, like the redwood area, in the forest area. In Jasper Ridge, they're pretty common. So it's really good to train your eyes to find them. And unlike other ants that I find by looking for movement, for these ants, you actually need to actively scan vegetation because they don't move. Okay. So our next species is Carycondalia, which is this other non-native ant that again is found in a few places, probably got into Jasper Ridge from the plant nursery that used to be here. And it's very small, it's kind of shiny, its little nodes here are pretty distinctive. And if you find something that kind of looks like this, just collect them, because we want to make sure that we know where they are. We haven't seen them, I think, in a while. So I wonder if they're still there and how they're doing. But yeah, so it's not, you know, a huge pest like Argentine ants. You never see too many of them. You see a few. They're active when it's pretty hot. There used to be a nest right outside the field station, but I'm not sure if it's still there. And you might have these at home, by the way. I do, I think. Okay, our next ant is Pseudomyrmex. So Pseudomyrmex belongs to a different subfamily, but it's just the only species we have from that group. These ants nest in trees, especially in manzanita trees. We have at least 2 small nests in our manzanitas in Jasper Ridge, which hopefully you will see during the training walk. And they're really cool. They're more active when it's hot, but you might see them if you stare at manzanitas. Also in other places in the Bay Area, they're not that rare. You just need to find the right place. They nest in old beetle holes in the manzanitas, and they're really cool ants. They kind of look like a wasp. They're orange, they walk somewhat fast. They look for dead insects on their manzanitas. Very, very cool ants. Our next ant is Nivomyrmex, or army ant. So this is a native army ant that lives here in California. It's also a cryptic species, so it nests underground and it forages underground. We usually don't see them. The best way to see them is to find dead ants of this species in a harvester ant mound, which is something that actually happens pretty often. If you look closely, they have no eyes because they're cryptic. And yeah, that's the best way to find them. We only saw them once, actually alive and moving, under a log on a rainy spring day. They're really cool. They don't really look like other ants. They're blind, shiny, weird, and we find them in harvester ant nests. Okay, it's just getting late. I want to let you ask some questions if you need to. Don't forget that in an ant nest, we so far only focus on the workers. You might find a queen with wings or without wings. You might find a male, you might find other things, but we can only identify the workers, so no need to collect the others. It's difficult to identify them anyway. And yeah, and the ants have this like bended antenna with, or elbow, or whatever you want to call that. And yeah, my almost last slide is some things to keep in mind. Is the ant walking on a trail? Okay, if it is, it could be Argentine ant, or otherwise house ant, or winter ant. If it's sometime on a trail, then it could be velvety tree ant. Does it smell? Then that could help us identify it as velvety tree ant or odorous house ant. Does it move fast or slow? If it moves very fast, like a spider, it could be Formica, field ant. If it's very, very slow, it could be Temnothorax or Chromatogaster. Which habitat are you in? In the grassland, it could be the harvester ant or big-headed ant that we might find there. Okay, so all these things are really helpful when you're trying to identify ants and trying to figure out what they are. And thank you. Oh, and then we have different guides that we will be able to provide you with. Yeah, but more important, like if anyone has any questions or comments. Or if you're just here for the t-shirt, that's fine too. I'm just trying to see if there are any questions in the phone.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at a phenogaster. How big approximately is that one compared to, um, yeah, does that one have like a millimeter size generally?
Let's see if I had it in the presentation. So in general, they're smaller than the harvester ant, but bigger than the smaller ants. Like, yeah, I don't have it here. Maybe I couldn't find it online.
Okay, small.
But they're bigger than like the winter ants and the much smaller ants. Because I see that it's like, 3-4 categories. So we have the small ants, tiny ants, kind of medium size, and then the large ones. So it's somewhere in the medium size, I would say, like a small formica, right, Matthew? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And we have, I was just trying to find it on my desktop. We have one of our handouts is a key that's set up by size. And so you
Yeah.
can kind of walk through it that way. And again, these are a number of resources that'll be available in person. We can send them digitally as well.
I had sort of I don't know, strange question. You mentioned serpentine, and I know that the ridge up there where the grass is the serpentine. I'll be in a serpentine grassland tomorrow down in Sierra Azul Open Space Preserve, and I was wondering, are there certain ants that they actually like the serpentine? Like,
Yeah.
when you have XYZ type soil, like they're attracted.
Oh, if they like the soil itself, I don't know if they like the soil, but they like the plants. So they like the habitat with the grassland. They could do well in a different grassland maybe, but they need the seeds from these different plants. And can you hear that noise? Yeah, okay. Let me close my door. Just a second. Okay. Yeah, so they need the seeds, and usually you'll find them in the grassland or in the edge of the grassland. And other ants that might like serpentine grassland. So I mentioned the big-headed ant. So they also eat seeds, but smaller ones. And you could find a whole range of other ants. You might find winter ants. You might find chromatogaster, the acrobat ant. You might find different things. They're difficult to find in the middle of the grassland, as we noticed during our surveys. But if you look at larger plants, it's sometimes easier, even in the grassland. Because the grassland, is just so big in Jasper Ridge that sometimes it's very difficult to see either nests or any ant activity. But when we look at the oaks or the coyote brush that is, scattered in that area, that's sometimes where we see more ants. But it doesn't mean that they're not in the grassland, just that it's more difficult to find them there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. So we will have a training walk on May 6th, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about that, Matthew?
Yes, I think I actually don't know if Angie shared this information or not, but so Saturday, May 6th, we're going to have an ant walk, I think starting at 9 a.m. from the Jasper Ridge field station, and there will be instructions on how to get to the field station itself if you've never been. And then the idea there is you'll get to see them in person. We're going to walk through stuff quickly and also introduce you to the tablets that we use for data collection and the eye buttons. All that should be pretty straightforward, but it's a fun time to start to get to know the other ant enthusiasts and spend some time at Jasper Ridge looking at stuff in closer detail.
Yeah, and we might offer another walk on a weekday afternoon on the other side of Jasper Ridge, which is also really cool, and that's where you see most flowers now. I don't know how many we'll see. That would be probably just before the survey. So the survey itself is May 20th, and probably the week before we'll offer another walk. Usually it's like 5:30 at the back end of the preserve. And then we go into the grassland and a little bit of forest habitat, and there's lots of stuff to see there as well.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to end the recording now and